The Empathic Echo. By Thomas King. Chapter 6. Whispers of the Shadow Syndicate. The training chamber remained a sanctuary of focused intensity, the air still thick with the scent of ozone and the lingering echo of Zan's recent breakthrough. Yet, even as Zan wrestled with the subtle art of nurturing his inner flame, a different kind of vigilance was unfolding. Elara, her movements as fluid and silent as a moonlit fog, carried the weight of a brewing storm. The whispers, once faint and easily dismissed as the ramblings of the desperate or the deluded, had coalesced into a tangible threat, a shadow stretching its tendrils across Ethelgard. It was a network, she had learned, woven from threads of greed, ambition, and a chilling hunger for forbidden power. The Shadow Syndicate, they called themselves. A name that evoked the very essence of their operations, clandestine, insidious, and utterly corrupting. They were not mere street thugs or petty thieves. Their reach extended far beyond the grimy alleys and darkened taverns that constituted the kingdom's underbelly. They trafficked in secrets, in whispers that could topple lords and ignite rebellions, and in artifacts that pulsed with a dangerous, untamed magic. Elara's investigation had begun subtly, a series of hushed conversations with informants cultivated over years, merchants who dealt in more than just silks and spices, and scholars whose curiosity had led them down paths best left untrodden. She pieced together fragments of information, like a mosaic artist assembling shards of a shattered mirror. The syndicate preyed on the vulnerable, offering power to those who felt wronged, solace to those consumed by despair, and wealth to those drowning in poverty. They offered a warped kind of salvation, a twisted path that inevitably led to ruin. There were stories, hushed and fearful, of individuals driven to madness by the artifacts they acquired, of families torn apart by betrayals orchestrated by syndicate agents, of local enmities fanned into full-blown conflicts with their unseen manipulation. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate pattern, a slow, methodical destabilization of the kingdom from within. The syndicate's ultimate goal remained an enigma, a puzzle shrouded in layers of secrecy, but the destabilizing effect of their actions was undeniable. It was a rot spreading from the foundations, unseen and unfelt by most, but threatening to bring the grand edifice of Ethelgard crashing down. One such ripple had reached her ears just yesterday, a tale from the docks of Port Azure, a place usually rife with its own brand of low-level skirmishes and territorial disputes. A new player had emerged, a figure known only as the Serpent, who had seemingly materialized from nowhere, wielding an unnerving influence over the dockworkers and smugglers. Goods moved with unprecedented speed and secrecy. Rival gangs were either bought out or violently dispersed, and a general air of fear, thicker than the usual sea mist, had descended upon the waterfront. Elara's sources, usually reliable, had been unable to procure more than a fleeting description: a man, unnaturally gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold the cold glint of polished obsidian and a voice that slithered into the listener's ear like a serpent's hiss. He dealt in trinkets, they said, small, intricately carved charms that promised luck and protection, but carried a faint, metallic tang of something far more sinister. More than one sailor had boasted of their newfound fortune, only to be found days later, their possessions gone, their bodies racked with a wasting sickness that defied any healer's touch. This was the syndicate's modus operandi: sowing discord, exploiting desperation, and peddling their tainted wares. They operated in the gray spaces, the liminal zones between legality and outright criminality, where influence could be bought and loyalty was a fleeting commodity. Their agents were masters of disguise, chameleon-like individuals who could blend into any crowd, their motives masked by a veneer of normalcy. Some were hardened mercenaries, others disenfranchised scholars, and still others were simply souls twisted by a lust for power, their own innate abilities amplified by the syndicate's illicit means. Elara's own methods of investigation were as nuanced as the organization she was tracking. She did not employ brute force or overt intimidation. Instead, she relied on her network of contacts, her keen observational skills, and her ability to discern truth from falsehood. She listened to the idle gossip of tavern keepers, the hushed confessions of repentant criminals, the cryptic warnings of seers who operated on the fringes of society. Each fragment, no matter how small, was a piece of the puzzle, a potential clue to the syndicate's inner workings. She had learned that their artifacts were not merely objects of power, but conduits. They amplified existing desires, twisted ambitions, and magnified fears. A man seeking wealth might be driven to obsessive, ruinous schemes. A woman yearning for love might become a prisoner of obsessive, suffocating devotion. The syndicate offered a shortcut, a seemingly easy path to one's deepest desires, but the price was always steeper than the user could ever imagine. The artifacts were often imbued with curses, with lingering enchantments that slowly eroded the user's will, their sanity, their very being, until they were nothing more than a puppet, dancing to the unseen strings of their benefactors. A particular artifact had recently surfaced in the clandestine markets of the capital city, Eldoria. It was a locket, crafted from a dark, unknown metal, etched with symbols that Alara's extensive research had identified as belonging to an ancient, forbidden school of sorcery. The locket was said to grant its wearer the ability to sow discord and paranoia amongst their enemies, turning friend against friend with a mere thought. The Whispers claimed it had been used to fracture a prominent merchant guild, leading to widespread economic disruption and a sudden, inexplicable surge in petty crime within the guild's territories. The irony was not lost on Alara. The syndicate thrived on the chaos they created, using the ensuing instability to further their own hidden agendas. The syndicate's influence was not limited to the criminal underworld. Alara had uncovered evidence of their agents infiltrating positions of minor authority within the city watch, the merchant guilds, and even some of the more obscure scholarly institutions. They were subtle, patient, and utterly ruthless. Their goal was not simply to profit, but to erode the very fabric of Ethelgard's society, to weaken its institutions, and to sow seeds of distrust and division that would pave the way for their ultimate ascent. Zan, engrossed in the delicate dance of awakening his elemental spirit, remained oblivious to the full extent of the danger brewing around him. For him, the immediate challenges were internal, conquering his doubts, mastering his emotions, and coaxing the elusive salamander spirit into a more sustained manifestation. Alara, however, carried the dual burden of training her promising, albeit volatile, student and safeguarding the kingdom from a threat that operated in the shadows, a threat that could undermine everything they were striving to protect. She ensured their training sessions were conducted with utmost discretion. The abandoned training grounds they used, a secluded clearing deep within the Whisperwood, were far from prying eyes. Her informants were sworn to absolute secrecy, their loyalty ensured through a complex web of favors, debts, and veiled threats. She knew that if the syndicate were to discover Zan's potential, or more importantly, Alara's own capabilities, they would become a target. The discovery of a nascent elemental mage, especially one trained by a former knight of the Obsidian Order, would be a prize beyond measure for an organization that trafficked in such power. One of Alara's most valuable, yet most volatile, sources was a shadowy figure known only as Silas. Silas was a notorious information broker operating out of the Rookery, the most impoverished and crime-ridden district of Eldoria. He possessed an uncanny ability to acquire information from even the most tightly guarded sources, but his services came at a steep price, often involving dangerous favors or morally ambiguous tasks. Silas dealt in secrets, and his own life was a testament to the perilous nature of his trade, his face a roadmap of scars and his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings with a hunter's paranoia. Alara had met Silas under the cloak of a moonless night, the air thick with the stench of refuse and desperation. He had been waiting for her in a disused cellar, the only illumination provided by a sputtering oil lamp that cast grotesque shadows on the damp stone walls. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, each word seemingly weighed down by the secrets he carried. He confirmed Alara's fears, detailing the syndicate's recent movements and the increasing boldness of their operations. "They're getting bolder, Alara," Silas had rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heard whispers from the Guild of Alchemists. Someone's been acquiring volatile reagents. Things that haven't been seen on the market in decades. Stuff that can rip a hole in reality, they say. And they're paying top coin, no questions asked." He had then produced a small, tarnished silver locket, identical to the one Alara had heard about. He had acquired it from a desperate courier who had been found dead a few days later, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have frozen him in his final moments. "This," Silas had said, his voice dropping even lower, "is what they call a whisper of discord. Sows madness, turns allies into enemies. A nasty piece of work. The one who owned it, He thought he was making a fortune. Now, he's just another stiff in the gutter, and his family is left with nothing but debt and fear. Elara had taken the locket, her fingers tracing the chillingly intricate etchings. The very air around it felt colder, more oppressive. She could sense the dark energies coiled within, a testament to the syndicate's mastery of forbidden arts. Silas had then leaned closer, his scarred face contorted in a grimace. There's more. They're looking for something, or someone. Something powerful. And they're not the only ones who are interested. The whispers of unrest in the border towns, that's not just coin and dissatisfaction. There's a darker hand guiding that too. A shadow behind the shadows. The implications were chilling. The syndicate was not merely a criminal organization. They were orchestrating a larger, more insidious plan, one that involved destabilizing the kingdom on multiple fronts. The unrest in the border towns, a problem that had been quietly plaguing the King's Council for months, was now being linked to the syndicate's machinations. This suggested a coordinated effort, a multi-pronged attack designed to weaken Ethelgard from within and without. Elara paid Silas handsomely for his information, a pouch of carefully chosen gold coins that he inspected with the sharp eyes of a seasoned appraiser before disappearing back into the labyrinthine alleys of the rookery. The weight of the locket in her satchel felt like a physical burden, a tangible manifestation of the darkness she was fighting. Back in the relative safety of the training grounds, Elara observed Zen with a mixture of pride and growing apprehension. He was making progress, undeniable progress. The spark he had ignited was growing steadier, the golden luminescence between his fingers lasting longer, pulsing with a more consistent rhythm. He was learning to control the ebb and flow of his emotions, to find the calm amidst the storm, and in doing so, he was strengthening his connection to the salamander spirit. But as he focused on his internal world, on the delicate cultivation of joy and contentment, Elara was forced to confront the external threats that loomed larger with each passing day. The syndicate's influence was a creeping blight, and she feared that Zan's burgeoning power, however pure its source, might attract the attention of those who sought to corrupt and control it. The underbelly of Ethelgard was stirring, and the creatures that dwelled in its depths were beginning to emerge from the shadows, drawn by the promise of power and the scent of opportunity. The peace that Zan was striving to cultivate within himself was a fragile thing, and Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the true test of his strength would come not in the quiet sanctuary of the training grounds, but in the treacherous darkness of the world beyond its protective walls. She had to prepare him, not just for the mastery of elemental magic, but for the harsh realities of a kingdom teetering on the brink, a kingdom where shadows held sway and the price of power was often paid in blood and despair. The syndicate was a cancer, and Elara was determined to excise it before it consumed Ethelgard entirely, even if it meant drawing her promising student into the very heart of the darkness she sought to eradicate. The quiet hum of Eldoria's ambient magic, a subtle resonance born from the collective emotions of its populace, had always been a comforting presence to Elara. It was a predictable tide, rising with the city's joys and receding with its sorrows, a testament to the ingrained arcane sensitivity of Ethelgard's people. But recently, a discordant note had begun to punctuate this familiar melody. Reports, initially dismissed as the exaggerated fears of those dwelling in the city's less savory districts, spoke of something far more unsettling, pockets of raw, untamed energy that flared and died with alarming randomness. These weren't the gentle ebbs and flows of communal feeling, they were sharp, violent spikes, like lightning strikes in a clear sky, leaving behind a strange, acrid residue in the ether. The initial dispatches were fragmented, pieced together from hushed conversations with overworked city watch patrols and the wary whispers of tavern owners who claimed their patrons were too spooked to venture out after dusk. They spoke of flickering lights in abandoned warehouses, of unnerving tremors that shook the foundations of tenements, and of a palpable sense of dread that settled over entire blocks for hours on end. At first, Elara's instincts attributed these anomalies to the volatile nature of the lower districts themselves. A concentration of despair, anger, and desperation could indeed warp the ambient magic in unpredictable ways. However, the descriptions grew more specific, more alarming. The energy wasn't merely chaotic, it was alien. It felt wrong, like a discordant chord played on a celestial harp, jarring and out of place. One such report, relayed by a grizzled watchman named Corvus, who had seen his fair share of unusual occurrences but never anything quite like this, painted a particularly vivid picture. He described a patch of alleyway near the old smelting district, an area long since abandoned due to toxic fumes and structural decay, suddenly erupting in a blinding flash of emerald light. The phenomenon, he claimed, lasted only a few seconds, but the residual energy was so potent that it caused the hairs on his arms to stand on end and left a faint, metallic tang in the air that lingered for hours. His men, who had been on a routine patrol nearby, reported experiencing intense waves of nausea and disorientation, accompanied by vivid, unsettling hallucinations that mirrored their deepest fears. Corvus, a man not easily frightened, admitted that the experience had left him deeply disturbed. He had touched the wall of the alley where the light had originated, and he described it as feeling unnaturally cold, as if it had been leached of all warmth and vitality. Elara meticulously cross-referenced these accounts, overlaying them with the known operational zones of the Shadow Syndicate. The correlation was undeniable and deeply concerning. The locations of these anomalous energy signatures, the docks, the undercity tunnels, the neglected industrial sectors, were precisely the areas where the Syndicate's tendrils were known to be strongest. This wasn't merely a coincidence. The Syndicate, with their insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge and their willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve their goals, were the most likely culprits. The question was, what were they doing? Were they experimenting with new, dangerous forms of arcane manipulation, or had they stumbled upon something ancient and volatile and were now seeking to exploit it? The possibility that the Syndicate was not just operating within the city but actively warping its fundamental magical structure was a chilling one. Their usual methods involved manipulating people, not the very fabric of arcane energy. Trafficking in corrupted artifacts, whispering promises of power, and orchestrating social unrest were their hallmarks. But these energy fluctuations suggested a far more direct, and potentially devastating, engagement with magic itself. Elara recalled Silas's words about the Guild of Alchemists, about volatile reagents capable of ripping holes in reality. Could the Syndicate be synthesizing or channeling energies of such a magnitude? She dispatched several of her most trusted informants to these affected areas, tasking them with discreet observation and, if possible, the collection of any residual magical traces. One of these informants, a young woman named Lyra who possessed a natural affinity for sensing subtle arcane shifts, returned with a disturbing report. She had spent an evening near the abandoned ironworks, a sprawling complex on the city's southern edge that had been shuttered for decades. The air there, she said, was thick with a peculiar stillness, a silence that felt more oppressive than any noise. Then, without warning, a wave of frigid air swept through the decaying structures, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. For a brief moment, the rusted machinery appeared to shimmer with an unnatural, internal light, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. Lyra, usually unflappable, had been forced to retreat, the sheer wrongness of the sensation overwhelming her. She described a faint, lingering scent, not of ozone or sulfur, but something akin to decay and static electricity, a scent that made her skin crawl. Another informant, a former street urchin named Finn, known for his uncanny ability to navigate the city's forgotten pathways, reported witnessing a similar phenomenon in the labyrinthine sewers beneath the old quarter. He had been tracking a known Syndicate courier when a sudden surge of emerald light, mirroring Corvus's description, erupted from a ventilation grate above him. The light was accompanied by a deafening roar that echoed through the tunnels, and the water flowing through the channels began to boil and churn violently. Finn, hiding in the shadows, observed the Syndicate courier, a gaunt man with feverish eyes, emerge from a nearby access point. The courier clutched a small, intricately carved wooden box, and as he held it aloft, a faint, sickly green aura pulsed around it, seeming to draw the very light from the surrounding phosphorescent fungi. The courier then spoke in a rasping whisper, words that Finn couldn't quite discern, but the intent was clear. He was channeling, or perhaps commanding, the volatile energy. As quickly as it appeared, the phenomenon subsided, leaving Finn with a ringing in his ears and a profound sense of unease. The Syndicate courier, seemingly invigorated, then vanished deeper into the sewer network. The nature of these energy signatures was particularly alarming. They were not consistent with any known form of elemental magic, or even the more chaotic manifestations of raw, emotional sorcery. There was a quality to them that spoke of deliberate manipulation, of arcane forces being bent and twisted in unnatural ways. Elara's mind immediately went to the forbidden texts she had studied during her time with the Obsidian Order, to the hushed tales of sorcerers who had sought to tap into energies from realms beyond Ethelgard, or who had delved into arts that warped life and death itself. Such practices were anathema, dangerous not only to the wielder but to the very fabric of reality. The Syndicate's involvement elevated the threat level considerably. They weren't just a criminal enterprise. They were actively seeking and wielding powers that could destabilize the kingdom on a fundamental level. Elara knew that Zan's training, while crucial, was only one part of the battle. She had to understand the nature of these anomalous energies, how they were being generated, and what the Syndicate intended to do with them. If these surges of power were a byproduct of their experiments, what was their ultimate goal? Were they trying to weaponize these energies, perhaps to destabilize the city's defenses or to create localized areas of magical nullification? Or were they attempting to create something new, a corrupted form of magic that they could control and profit from? She spent hours poring over ancient scrolls and fragmented lore, searching for any mention of similar energy phenomena. Her research pointed towards ancient, forgotten practices, whispers of rituals that drew upon the primal forces of creation and destruction, arts that had been sealed away for good reason. The emerald hue mentioned in the reports was particularly significant, often associated with corrupting influences and the perversion of natural life forces. It spoke of energies that were not merely raw, but inherently poisonous, like a festering wound upon the world's arcane tapestry. The implications were vast and terrifying. If the Syndicate possessed the ability to generate such powerful, volatile energies, they could become an unstoppable force. They could cripple trade routes, sow widespread panic, or even unleash catastrophic magical events that could lay entire districts to waste. The city's guard, despite their bravery, were ill-equipped to deal with threats of this magnitude. They could quell riots and apprehend common criminals, but they were defenseless against arcane assaults of this nature. Elara felt a growing urgency to involve Zan, not necessarily in the direct investigation, but in understanding the broader implications. His training was focused on balance and control, on fostering a pure connection to elemental forces. This contrasted sharply with the corrupted, volatile energies being reported. She envisioned a future where Zan's burgeoning power would be a bulwark against such darkness, but to achieve that, he needed to understand the nature of the threats he might one day face. The Shadow Syndicate wasn't just a collection of criminals. They were actively seeking to unravel the very foundations of Ethelgard, and these anomalous energy signatures were a clear indication that their methods were becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous. The whispers in the shadows were growing louder, and now, they were accompanied by the terrifying hum of corrupted magic. Elara traced the intricate network of the city's underbelly, her informants. Fragmented reports coalescing into a single, disquieting destination. The whispers, once hushed and easily dismissed, now spoke of a name, Kalen. A name that echoed with a disgraced past, a former prodigy of the Royal Alchemical Guild, now a shadow lurking in the very districts the Syndicate favored. His expulsion, she knew, was not for simple malpractice, but for delving into arcane arts deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, arts that flirted with the volatile essence of emotion itself. It was a path many alchemists, driven by ambition or obsession, had tread with caution, but Kalen, it was said, had not just tread, he had plunged headfirst into the abyss. The slums, a labyrinth of crumbling tenements and shadowed alleyways, were a stark contrast to the gilded halls of the Royal Guild. Here, the air hung thick with the stench of refuse and desperation, a potent brew that mirrored the very emotions Kalen was rumored to have sought to harness. His reputation preceded him like a phantom limb, a constant ache of what could have been, intertwined with the chilling fear of what he might become. Some whispered of his continued experiments, conducted in secret, fueled by a burning desire for vindication. Others hinted at a far more sinister association, suggesting his considerable arcane talents had been bought by the Syndicate, his knowledge a tool for their shadowy machinations. Elara found him not in a clandestine laboratory teeming with bubbling retorts and arcane diagrams, but in a cramped, musty room above a disreputable tavern, the kind that thrived on illicit trade and hushed conversations. The air within was thick with the cloying scent of strange herbs and something metallic, almost like old blood. Kalen himself was a gaunt figure, his once sharp features now etched with a weariness that spoke of years spent wrestling with forbidden knowledge and the bitterness of exile. His eyes, however, still held a spark, a restless intelligence that darted around the room, analyzing, assessing, missing nothing. They were the eyes of a scholar, but also of a predator, a man who had tasted power and found it intoxicating, even if it had cost him everything. "You are not the usual clientele of the tipsy goblin mistress," Kalen said, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of warmth. He didn't rise from his stool, merely gestured with a skeletal hand towards a rickety chair opposite him. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through the grimy window, illuminating the alchemist's threadbare robes and the faint tremor in his hands. Elara remained standing, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered space. Shelves overflowed with vials of obscure liquids, stoppered jars containing things best left unidentified, and stacks of brittle, leather-bound tomes. A tarnished alembic sat on a makeshift table, its surface stained with countless experiments. This was the den of a man obsessed, a man who had traded his standing for the pursuit of forbidden truths. "I am told you have a unique understanding of arcane energies, Master Kalen. Energies that deviate from the conventional," she stated, her voice calm, measured, cutting through the room's oppressive atmosphere. Kalen gave a short, humorless laugh. "Unique? That is a polite word for it, is it not? They called me heretical. Mad, the guild prefers its magic to be predictable. Like well-behaved children. Mine, however, has always had a mind of its own." He picked up a small, crystalline vial, swirling its contents, a shimmering, opalescent liquid that seemed to pulse with an inner light. "The ambient magic of Ethelgard is a symphony, they say. A gentle hum. But a symphony can be disrupted, can it not? A single sour note can unravel the entire composition." Elara felt a prickle of unease. He spoke of the city's magic, of its composition, in a way that suggested intimate knowledge, a knowledge that extended beyond the theoretical. "The recent disruptions, the anomalous energy signatures, they have been particularly discordant." Kalen's lips curved into a thin smile. "Discordant. Yes, that is an apt description. It is the sound of the symphony breaking. Of the predictable order giving way to something else. Something far more vibrant, far more real." He paused, his gaze finally settling on Elara, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "You seek answers, do you not? You are not one of the city's simpering mages, content with their neat little spells and predictable outcomes. You seek the truth, however ugly it may be. I seek to understand what is happening to our city," Elara replied, her voice steady. "And I am told you possess knowledge that could illuminate these shadows." "Knowledge," Kalen mused, setting the vial down with a soft click. "Knowledge is a dangerous commodity, mistress. It is a flame that can illuminate the darkest corners, or it can consume the one who wields it. The guild taught me much, but they feared what I discovered. They feared the power that lay not in precise incantations and balanced elements, but in the raw, untamed currents of emotion. Joy, sorrow, rage, fear, these are not mere fleeting feelings, you see. They are primal forces, capable of shaping reality itself. Imagine, if you will, bottling the despair of 1,000 broken hearts, or the exhilaration of 100,000 triumphant cheers. What kind of power could that unleash?" His words sent a shiver down Elara's spine, a dark echo of the emerald flashes and unsettling tremors reported in the city. This was precisely the kind of alchemy the guild had feared, the kind that blurred the lines between creation and destruction. "They expelled you for this pursuit?" "They expelled me for success," Kalen corrected, a bitter edge to his voice. "I was on the cusp of something extraordinary. I could have revolutionized alchemy, made it a force of true societal impact. But they, in their fear, cast me out. Branded me a pariah. Left me to rot in these gutters, while they continued to churn out their sterile, predictable potions. They hoard their power, afraid to truly understand it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But the Syndicate, they are not so timid. They understand power. They crave it. And they are willing to explore avenues that the guild would never dare to tread." Elara's suspicions sharpened. You have been working with them, then? These energy surges, are they your work? Or theirs? Kalen gave a slow, deliberate nod. Let us just say that my unique talents have found a willing audience. The guild's expulsion was a cage, mistress. The syndicate offered me freedom. The freedom to experiment, to push the boundaries, to prove them all wrong. And yes, their recent endeavors have certainly been most illuminating. He gestured vaguely towards the window, towards the sprawling, decaying city beyond. The emerald light you have heard whispers of? It is the signature of potent emotional resonance, amplified and focused. It is the raw energy of a city's collective psyche, twisted and weaponized. Weaponized? Elara's voice was tight with concern. Against whom? For what purpose? The purpose is always the same with such groups, is it not? Kalen's eyes gleamed with a mixture of cynicism and a strange sort of pride. To sow chaos, to destabilize, to create opportunities for them to seize control. Imagine, if you will, targeting a district, and amplifying the fear of its inhabitants until it becomes a tangible force, a suffocating miasma that paralyzes all who dwell within. Or conversely, a surge of manic euphoria that drives a population into a frenzy, making them susceptible to any suggestion. They are not merely using crude explosives or brute force, mistress. They are wielding the very emotions that define us, shaping them into instruments of terror. He picked up another vial, this one containing a deep, swirling indigo fluid. This, he said, holding it up, is a distillation of focused despair. It can drain the life and will from a man with a single drop. And this, he gestured to another, a vibrant, pulsating crimson, is the essence of unbridled rage. It can drive a sane to commit unspeakable acts. The syndicate has provided the resources, the willing subjects for experimentation. I have provided the catalysts, the knowledge to channel these volatile energies into something potent. Elara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was far more insidious than she had imagined. The syndicate wasn't just dealing in stolen goods and political intrigue. They were actively manipulating the very emotional fabric of the city, turning its people's feelings into a weapon against them. And these surges, the random flares of energy? Are they controlled? Kalen shrugged, a gesture that conveyed a profound indifference to the consequences. Control is a relative term, is it not? When one is dealing with forces as volatile as raw emotion, there are always unpredictable side effects. Sometimes the containment falters. Sometimes the resonance becomes too strong, too wild. These flares you have heard of? They are the uncontrolled outbursts of immense power, like a dam bursting. The syndicate is learning, mistress. They are becoming more adept at channeling, at focusing. But they are still clumsy. Ambitious, but clumsy. He paused, his gaze drifting to the stained alembic. They come to me, seeking to understand how to replicate the effects, how to harness them more reliably. They believe it is a matter of precise alchemical formulas, of specific reagents. And to a degree, they are correct. But they fail to grasp the fundamental truth. Emotion is not a reagent to be measured and mixed. It is a living force. It must be understood, respected, coaxed. And, he added, his voice growing colder, sometimes it must be forced. Elara sensed a deeper, more personal motivation beneath his detached pronouncements. You speak of vindication, Master Kalen. Of proving the guild wrong. Is that truly your only goal? Or is there a personal score you wish to settle? Kalen's gaze snapped back to her, the earlier spark in his eyes now blazing with a dark intensity. They stripped me of my title, of my research, of my future. They cast me out into the darkness, believing they had silenced me. But they only made me stronger. They gave me the anonymity I needed to truly explore the depths of my craft. And now I will show them the true potential of what they feared. I will show them that their safe and predictable magic is but a pale imitation of true power. He leaned back, a strange serenity settling over his features, as if the embrace of his dark purpose had brought him a perverse form of peace. The syndicate, for all their ruthlessness, understand ambition. They understand the hunger for more. They provide the canvas and I provide the brushstrokes. We are two sides of the same coin, mistress. Both ostracized, both driven by a desire to transcend the limitations imposed upon us. But the cost, Master Kalen, Elara pressed, her voice laced with a warning. The cost of this ambition. These energies, they are inherently destructive. They are corrupting. You speak of shaping reality, but you are also tearing it apart. Kalen's smile returned, devoid of any genuine humor. Is not all progress, at some point, a form of destruction? The old must be broken for the new to emerge. The Guild clings to its outdated doctrines, fearing change. The Syndicate, in its own way, seeks to shatter the existing order. And I am the architect of that shattering. I am the one who understands the fundamental building blocks of power, the true nature of the arcane. They may have the brute force, the numbers, the reach. But I have the understanding. And understanding, mistress, is the most potent weapon of all. He picked up the indigo vial again, turning it in his fingers. You come here seeking answers about the Syndicate, about their newfound methods. You will find them, but perhaps not in the way you expect. They are not merely using forbidden artifacts or dark rituals. They are delving into the very essence of what it means to be alive, to feel, and they are twisting it into something monstrous. And I am their willing accomplice, their visionary alchemist. Elara studied him, the complex web of his motivations, the thirst for knowledge, the sting of betrayal, the allure of power. He was a dangerous man, a fallen star whose brilliance had been twisted by bitterness and ambition. He was a vital link, a potential source of information about the Syndicate's increasingly terrifying operations, but also a testament to the dark path they were treading. The whispers of the Shadow Syndicate were no longer just whispers. They were the dangerous pronouncements of a disgraced alchemist, a harbinger of a new, terrifying era of arcane warfare. She knew she had to tread carefully, for in understanding Kalen, she risked becoming entangled in the very darkness she sought to expose. His knowledge was a double-edged sword capable of revealing the Syndicate's plans, but also of leading her down a path from which there might be no return. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, charged with the unspoken threat of his power, and the chilling reality of the Syndicate's escalating war against the city. The fragmented pieces of information Elara had painstakingly gathered from the city's underbelly, from the whispers of dockhands and the hurried confessions of petty thieves, began to coalesce into a disturbing, yet increasingly coherent, tapestry. It was a narrative far more complex and terrifying than mere greed or territorial disputes could explain. The Syndicate, she was coming to understand, was not driven by the acquisition of gold or the control of smuggling routes. Their ambitions reached into a far more primal and volatile domain, the very emotional core of Ethelgard and its inhabitants. Her network of informants, usually a reliable barometer of the city's clandestine activities, had been struggling to articulate the subtle yet profound shifts in the Syndicate's operations. They spoke of unusual gatherings in darkened warehouses, not for the transfer of contraband, but for the silent, almost reverential observation of something. They described hushed discussions, not about market prices or rival gang territories, but about resonance, amplification, and harvesting. These were not the terms of common criminals, but of individuals dabbling in forces they barely understood, yet were clearly intent on mastering. Elara had pressed them, using a combination of veiled threats and carefully placed coin, to dig deeper, to bring back more than just fragmented phrases. The breakthrough had come with a nervous scrivener, a man whose job it was to record the Syndicate's ledgers and inventory. He had been caught in a lapse of judgment, trading information for a moment of courage fueled by cheap spirits. Trembling, his eyes darting nervously towards every shadow, he had spoken of the emotional conduits. He described arcane devices, intricate and unsettling in their design, that were being developed and tested in secret locations across the city. These devices, he stammered, were not for transmitting messages or channeling arcane energy in the traditional sense. They were designed to draw out, to capture, and to amplify the raw, untamed power of human emotion. They call them etheric resonators. The scrivener had whispered, his voice barely audible above the din of the tavern Elara had chosen for their clandestine meeting. He had wiped sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. They're like nets, mistress. But instead of catching fish, they catch feelings. The strong ones. The ones that grip you when you're scared, or angry, or overjoyed. He paused, swallowing hard. And they don't just catch them. They make them bigger. Brighter. Like igniting a bonfire from a single spark. Elara had pressed him for details, for the purpose behind such an endeavor. The scrivener, though terrified, had offered what he knew, piecing together overheard conversations and fragmented observations. The syndicate, it seemed, had discovered that the city was not merely a collection of individuals, but a vast, interconnected nexus of emotional energy. Every fear, every hope, every surge of joy or despair that rippled through Ethelgard contributed to a collective psychic hum, an ambient resonance that most people were entirely unaware of. The syndicate, however, under the guidance of individuals like Kaelin, had found a way to tap into this reservoir. It's not about money, not directly. The scrivener had explained, his voice taking on a strange awe, tinged with fear. They believe that whoever controls the emotions of the people, controls the people themselves. If they can amplify fear, they can paralyze a district. If they can amplify anger, they can incite riots. If they can manipulate hope, well, they can make people believe anything, follow anyone. He shuddered. They spoke of creating emotional storms, mistress. Cataclysmic waves of feeling that would sweep through the city, shattering order, creating chaos, and leaving the syndicate to pick up the pieces. This was a chilling revelation. The emerald lights that had flickered across the sky, the localized tremors and unsettling shifts in atmosphere that had been reported, they were not random magical occurrences, but deliberate experiments. Each incident was a test, a calibration of these etheric resonators, a step towards their ultimate goal of wielding the city's collective emotional landscape as a weapon. They were not just a criminal organization, they were nascent psychic engineers, attempting to weaponize the very fabric of human experience. Elara's mind raced, connecting the scrivener's words with Kaelin's pronouncements. Kaelin, the disgraced alchemist, was not merely an associate, he was the architect of this horrifying new form of warfare. He understood the volatile nature of emotions, the potential for them to be distilled, amplified, and directed. He had spoken of bottling despair and channeling rage, and the scrivener's testimony confirmed that these were not abstract concepts but tangible, albeit dangerous, projects. The syndicate provided the resources and the ambition, but Kaelin was the one providing the forbidden knowledge, the understanding of how to transmute fleeting feelings into potent, destructive forces. The syndicate's ambition, therefore, was twofold: to destabilize the existing power structures through orchestrated chaos, and to fundamentally reshape society by gaining control over the populace's innermost feelings. It was a far more insidious objective than simple conquest. To control a city's emotions was to control its will, its actions, its very identity. They sought not to rule a kingdom of flesh and blood, but a kingdom of sentiment and reaction, a populace driven by their curated emotional responses. The implications were staggering. If the syndicate succeeded, there would be no true freedom, no genuine will left in Ethelgard. Every surge of patriotism, every act of defiance, every moment of quiet contentment could be manufactured, manipulated, or suppressed at will. The city's soul would become a commodity, its spirit a tool for those who sought dominion. It was a vision of absolute control, achieved not through overt tyranny, but through the subtle manipulation of the very things that made people human. Elara felt a growing sense of urgency. This was no longer a matter of uncovering a few smuggling rings or dismantling a minor crime syndicate. This was a battle for the very essence of Ethelgard. The whispers had become a roar, and the Shadow Syndicate was preparing to unleash a storm that would not only shake the city's foundations but also break the spirit of its people. She had to understand the full scope of their plans, the locations of their hidden laboratories, and the specific methods they employed, before this insidious ambition could be fully realized. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, a tangible burden, as she realized the true, terrifying nature of the enemy she faced. The Syndicate's ambition was not merely to rule, it was to redefine reality itself, one amplified emotion at a time. The scrivener, his confession extracted, had been given a discreet sum and a warning to disappear for a time. Elara left him with the understanding that his cooperation, however grudging, might have saved countless lives. As she moved through the darkened streets, the city's ambient noise seemed to take on a new significance. The distant murmur of the crowds, the laughter from a tavern, the cries of street vendors, she now heard them not just as sounds, but as potential fuel for the syndicate's insatiable appetite for power. Each emotion, however small, was a spark, and they were learning how to ignite them into infernos. She recalled Kalen's words about the discordant symphony. He had spoken of the guild's magic as predictable, like well-behaved children. But the syndicate, and Kalen himself, were embracing the wild, untamed power that lay beneath the surface. They saw the volatile energy of fear, anger, and even joy as a resource, a potent force to be harvested and wielded. The recent emerald flashes and unsettling atmospheric disturbances weren't just magical anomalies. They were the visible manifestations of this emotional energy being tested, amplified, and directed. It was a terrifying perversion of arcane arts, transforming the city's collective psyche into a weapon. The syndicate's ultimate aim, therefore, was not simply to gain political or economic power. It was to achieve absolute dominion by manipulating the very core of what made people act and react. If they could control the emotional currents that flowed through Ethelgard, they could control its destiny. They could sow discord and confusion, then step in to offer a false sense of order. They could incite riots and then present themselves as the only force capable of restoring peace, thereby seizing control from a weakened and fractured government. Their ambition was to become the unseen puppeteers of Ethelgard's populace, pulling the strings of fear, desire, and loyalty. Elara also pondered Kalen's role in this. His expulsion from the Royal Alchemical Guild for dabbling in forbidden arts, particularly those involving emotions, made him the perfect partner for the syndicate. He possessed the theoretical knowledge and the practical experience to build and operate these etheric resonators. He was driven by a desire to prove his former peers wrong, to demonstrate the immense power they had feared and suppressed. His bitterness and ambition had made him susceptible to the syndicate's promises of resources and freedom to experiment. He was, in essence, the mad genius behind their terrifyingly ambitious enterprise. She visualized the process: teams of syndicate operatives, perhaps disguised as ordinary citizens, subtly monitoring areas of high emotional intensity. Perhaps they would use specially crafted talismans or enchanted objects to either provoke or amplify specific feelings. A staged incident, a carefully worded rumor spread through the network of informants, or even a subtle enchantment cast upon a public gathering could create the necessary emotional surge. Then, the etheric resonators, hidden in nearby abandoned buildings or even disguised as mundane city fixtures, would draw in this amplified emotion, store it, and then release it in a targeted, devastating wave. Imagine, Elara thought, a surge of panic deliberately amplified in a marketplace, causing a stampede that would leave the area in chaos, ripe for the syndicate to exploit. Or a wave of unbridled rage directed at the city watch, turning public opinion against the very people sworn to protect them. Even more subtly, they could cultivate a sense of apathy and despair, slowly draining the will to resist from the population, making them compliant and easily manipulated. The syndicate's ambition was not to rule over a thriving city, but over a broken and emotionally subjugated one. The information from the Scrivener confirmed her deepest fears. The syndicate was not content with their shadowy existence. They were actively seeking to reshape the kingdom, not through conventional means of power, but through the psychological manipulation of its people. Their ambition was to transcend mere criminality and become a force that could dictate the very feelings and thoughts of Ethelgard's citizens. They were aiming for a level of control that no ruler had ever achieved, a dominion over the intangible, the subjective, the very essence of human experience. This was a war fought not with swords and spells, but with fear and hope, despair and exhilaration. And Elara knew, with a chilling certainty, that Ethelgard was teetering on the precipice of an unprecedented emotional cataclysm, orchestrated by the relentless ambition of the Shadow Syndicate. The danger was no longer confined to the back alleys. It was poised to engulf the entire city, feeding on the very emotions that defined them. The weight of the Scrivener's words settled upon Elara like a shroud. The ambition of the Shadow Syndicate was not merely to rule, but to redefine. They sought to weaponize the very essence of humanity, to twist the vibrant tapestry of emotions into a tool of absolute control. This wasn't the crude dominion of conquerors. It was a far more insidious form of subjugation, one that would leave its victims unaware they were even enslaved. Her mind, sharp and incisive, began to sift through the new information, piecing together fragments that had previously seemed disconnected. The whispers of arcane energies, the rumors of clandestine experiments, they were no longer abstract threats but tangible components of a terrifyingly grand design. And then, a chilling confluence of ideas sparked in her mind. The prophecy. She had dismissed it, at times, as the ramblings of a desperate seer, a collection of vague portents and allegorical warnings. But now, the syndicate's actions seemed to mirror its dire pronouncements with an unnerving precision. The prophecy spoke of a shadow that would seek to unravel the threads of time itself, of forces that would twist the natural order, and of a cacophony that would drown out the songs of the ages. Elara had always interpreted these lines in terms of grand, cosmic events, of celestial alignments, or the awakening of ancient evils. She had never considered that the unraveling of time could refer to something as seemingly localized, yet profoundly disruptive, as manipulating the present through control of its emotional undercurrents. Her gaze drifted unfocused towards a darkened corner of her study. The syndicate, under Kalen's twisted guidance, was indeed attempting to manipulate the natural order, the order of human feeling and reaction. They were creating a cacophony, not of sound, but of manipulated sentiment, a dissonant roar of amplified fear and manufactured rage designed to drown out reason, empathy, and genuine joy. The prophecy, she now understood, was not just a foretelling of doom. It was a stark warning about the nature of that doom. It was a warning about forces that operated not on the battlefield, but within the very souls of men and women. But it was a specific phrase within the prophecy that now sent a tremor of dread through her. The anomaly that holds the key, to be sought, to be feared, to be broken. She had pondered this for weeks, seeking out any unusual occurrences, any individuals or artifacts that might fit such a description. She had considered rare magical artifacts, ancient relics of immense power, or even individuals blessed, or cursed, with unique magical endowments. Yet the syndicate's focus on emotional resonance, on amplifying subjective experiences, had led her to believe their threat was more pervasive, less tied to a singular object or person. Until now. Her thoughts, like a flock of startled birds, suddenly converged on Zan. The young man, the wanderer she had taken under her wing, was an enigma. His presence seemed to ripple, to subtly alter the flow of moments around him. He spoke of dreams that felt like memories, of flashes of foresight that were unsettlingly accurate, of a sense of displacement, as if he were not entirely anchored in the present. He possessed an innate, almost unconscious, ability to perceive and sometimes even influence temporal currents. He was, Elara realized with a sickening certainty, the anomaly. The syndicate, particularly Kalen, with his insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge and his expertise in manipulating arcane energies, would undoubtedly see Zen not as a person, but as a resource, or worse, a threat to be neutralized. If they could harness his unique temporal abilities, what power could they not wield? Imagine the implications of being able to subtly shift the past, to preemptively crush dissent before it even formed, to nudge events in their favor with a whispered foresight. The ability to manipulate emotions was potent, but the ability to manipulate time itself? That was the ultimate power, the dominion over all possibilities. The prophecy's warning to seek and fear, the anomaly now took on a terrifying new dimension. The syndicate would seek Zan, not out of malice, but out of cold, calculating ambition. They would fear him, not because of his strength, but because his very existence represented a chaotic variable, an uncontrolled element that defied their meticulously crafted plans. And they would seek to break him, not necessarily to kill him, but to subjugate, to control, or to dissect his abilities until they could replicate and weaponize them. They would attempt to shackle his temporal essence, to turn his unique gift into another tool for their emotional dominion. Elara's resolve hardened. This was no longer just about protecting Ethelgard from a clandestine organization. It was about protecting Zan, the unwitting nexus of a prophecy and the potential target of the syndicate's most dangerous aspirations. His personal journey, his quest for understanding and belonging, had become inextricably intertwined with the fate of the city, and perhaps, the very flow of time. The whispers of the Shadow Syndicate had coalesced into a thunderous roar, and the storm they threatened to unleash was not just an emotional one, but a temporal one as well. She recalled the subtle ways Zan had already influenced events, the seemingly coincidental occurrences that had averted disaster or provided crucial insights. There was the time the market stall had nearly collapsed, a cascade of falling crates averted by a sudden, unexplained surge of stability in the air, a moment Zan had passed through, his brow furrowed as if in deep thought. Or the way he seemed to know when a particular alleyway was about to be ambushed, his intuition a sharp, unerring warning that had saved her life more than once. These were not mere instances of good fortune. They were ripples from his temporal abilities, subtle nudges in the fabric of reality. The Syndicate's experiments, she now suspected, were not merely focused on generating emotional storms. They were also likely probing for anomalies, for deviations from the norm that could be exploited. They would be studying the unusual energetic signatures, the subtle distortions in the ambient magical field that Zan's presence created. Kalen, in his pursuit of ultimate arcane understanding, would be desperate to unravel the secrets of temporal manipulation, a field far more complex and dangerous than even the manipulation of raw emotion. Consider the ramifications. If the Syndicate could control not only the emotions of Ethelgard's populace but also the very flow of moments, they would achieve a level of control that bordered on divinity. They could engineer events, subtly altering the past to ensure their future dominance. They could preempt any opposition, not by force, but by temporal manipulation, ensuring that opportunities for rebellion simply never arose. They could create a history that served their narrative, a present where their power was absolute, and a future where their reign was immutable. Zan, as the living embodiment of temporal anomaly, was the key to unlocking such terrifying potential. This realization brought a new layer of urgency to Alara's investigations. Her network of informants needed to be retasked. She needed to know if the Syndicate had identified Zan, if they had even the faintest inkling of his unique nature. Were there whispers of unusual energy readings in the areas Zan frequented? Had any of Kalen's associates shown an interest in individuals with peculiar temporal sensitivities? The answers to these questions were now paramount, for the danger to Zan was no longer just a secondary concern. It was intrinsically linked to the Syndicate's ultimate goals. She imagined the Syndicate's clandestine laboratories, not just filled with the humming etheric resonators designed to harvest fear and joy, but also with intricate devices designed to detect and perhaps even contain temporal distortions. Kalen, the disgraced alchemist, would undoubtedly be fascinated by the prospect of understanding and controlling time. His expulsion from the guild had been for dabbling in forbidden arts, arts that pushed the boundaries of understanding. Temporal magic, even more so than emotional manipulation, was the ultimate forbidden art, a power that could unravel the very fabric of existence. The Syndicate's interest in arcane energies, which had initially seemed like a general pursuit of power, now took on a more specific focus. They weren't just interested in raw magical might. They were interested in the fundamental forces that shaped reality. Emotions were the building blocks of consciousness and action, and time was the framework within which all existence unfolded. By mastering both, the Syndicate would become the architects of reality itself. Zan, the living embodiment of one of these fundamental forces, was their ultimate prize. Alara's mind raced, trying to anticipate the Syndicate's next moves. If they discovered Zan's abilities, they would attempt to isolate him, to study him, to extract his secrets. They might try to lure him with promises of understanding, of helping him control his gift, only to trap him. Or if they saw him as too dangerous to be controlled, they might seek to eliminate him, to snuff out the temporal anomaly before it could become a threat to their carefully constructed plans. The prophecy's warning to break him could manifest in myriad terrifying ways. She needed to warn Zan, to prepare him. But how could she explain the intricate web of prophecy, emotional manipulation, and temporal anomaly to a young man who was still struggling to understand his own place in the world? He was already burdened by the strangeness of his existence. Adding the weight of a shadowy Syndicate hunting him for his unique abilities, and a prophecy that seemed to foretell his doom, might crush him entirely. Yet the alternative was to let him walk unknowingly into a trap. The Syndicate's reach was long, and their methods were cunning. They were masters of the shadows, adept at exploiting vulnerabilities. If they identified Zan as the anomaly, their pursuit would be relentless and invisible until it was too late. The whispers of the Shadow Syndicate were no longer just a threat to the city's collective psyche. They were a direct, personal danger to Zan, and by extension, to the very integrity of the timeline. Alara knew she had to act to bridge the gap between the prophecy's cryptic pronouncements and the Syndicate's terrifyingly real ambitions, and to shield Zan from the converging threat that sought to exploit his very essence. The stakes had never been higher, for the fate of Ethelgard, and the delicate balance of time itself, now rested on the shoulders of a young man who was, himself, an anomaly.